All right, you happily miserable accursed. It's Herle here with your ever loving, ever cussing, ever able to shake off a Sunday night bender to get this pod recorded on a Monday morning political panel. Kory Teneycke is here, Jordan Leichnitz is here, and Scott Reid is here. You know, you guys, I have to say, I'm really happy that we got our big show at Maple Leaf Gardens done. And thank you to Christine Simonson for thinking big and having it at Maple Leaf Gardens. Otherwise, I'd be having some envy because on Saturday I was at something called the Paul Wells Christmas Show at the National Arts Center. And he puts together a variety show of all things. Singers and players and speakers and
no, it shouldn't work, but it does.
Humorous.
Excellent.
Does
it's like
it?
Dean Martin came out.
I was only part of it. But it had a big crowd and people seemed to really be enjoying themselves. It was a
awesome.
good event.
Well, Paul's a bit of a Renaissance man. He's got as great an interest in music, I think, as he does in politics, which is saying something.
There were 3 Juno award-winning jazz vocalists there.
He loves his jazz. And were you like the role of Don Rickles? Were you like, Paul, I've read your work, and quite frankly, it's weak.
By the way, you're out of scotch. Anyway,
Foster Brooks, it's fantastic.
Actually, I was on a panel with I was on a political panel. That was probably the most traditional thing about the pod. There was myself and Vashi and Brian Lilly on a panel, and it kind of went how you would anticipate.
How was that?
I wasn't going to ask. I was going to leave it undisturbed, that reference. I was just going to be like,
should we send a search party for Brian? Is he okay?
Well, I think the closest way, I think the best way of describing the difference in Brian's and my worldview is that Brian thinks that Trump is a normal president. Brian thinks that everybody has Trump derangement syndrome and that everybody always says, oh, this president's the end of the world, that president's the end of the world. This is just another one of those cycles. And when he's gone, be somebody else and it will all be fine. So that's such a different starting off base than I have that it's hard to talk about that in a simpatico way.
Yeah.
Well, there's about 10 billion grifty reasons why he's different than most.
I have a hard time imagining that national security strategy rolling out from another president, for example.
Yeah, well, just the sort of wholesale
that was
grifty stuff,
Yeah.
Totally. Yeah.
That national
I just want to say,
strategy, people should read it and they should read other people's analysis of it because there is no way to read that thing and not see that their vision of Canada is either as absorbed into the United States or a vassal state, one of the two. There's no concept of Canada being a relatively independent national actor in the future they envision.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. He thinks we're Poland.
Yeah. All right.
Been less than a year, guys.
My line,
more to come.
My consistent line when confronted with the Trump derangement syndrome thing, my consistent line to people is, you're fucking right, I have Trump derangement syndrome. And if you don't, you're deranged. Like, I don't understand this argument. People think they're insulting me or belittling me somehow. I'm like, yeah, like, goddamn straight. It's like Krypton is doomed. Jor-El, you're crazy. The entire Science Council disagrees with you. Fuck off.
All right. So what are we going to talk about today? We're going to talk about week 2 of the Memorandum of Understanding. The Conservatives are forcing a vote tomorrow, Tuesday, to suss out Liberal support of the pipeline. They obviously suspect that some British Columbia MPs, maybe some Quebec MPs, maybe some other MPs are going to have a hard time standing in their seats to vote for that. We will see. Our cursed clipping is a great piece from Susan Delacourt's opinion piece in the Toronto Star. Mark Carney's embrace of Liberal enemies could be a good thing for all of us. And it's such a great column that it would be our clipping of the week, even if it didn't mention Paul Martin in it. And then the politics of the loan to Algoma Steel, supporting a sovereign steel sector and managing tariff-related job loss. And then it's Mr. Pinsent and our Hey Yous. So, Kory, let's start off with this. So I think this is a clever move by the Conservatives in terms of tactics in the House of Commons go. Why wouldn't you do this? And why wouldn't you see if you can force some Liberal divisions out into the open. What do you expect to happen this week?
Well, I think that's the cleverest part of it is that. But I also think it's smart in another way. Like, I guess we'll see who votes with the government and who doesn't. It's going to really put a focus on that, which I think is good. But I think it takes a little bit of the energy out of the push on pipelines being just a liberal storyline, and gets the conservatives in that headline, because I think at the end of the day, it's not entirely good for the conservatives to have Daniel Smith batting her eyelashes at the prime minister and having frustration with the Liberal government decreasing in Western Canada in the way that it potentially could. Well, maybe not all of Western Canada, but certainly the prairies and the parts of BC that are accessible to the conservatives. So I think capturing part of that headline and demonstrating what I think the reality is, which is, the vast majority of Canada wants to see these kinds of projects go ahead. And if you want to centralize the party, or have the party see more mainstream and centrist and talking more about the big issues and less about the more marginal issues, it doesn't get any bigger than the pipeline debate right now in part of the country. So I think it's smart in a few ways, and I'll be very curious to see whether the Liberal caucus votes in favor of it. But I think even if they do, a good move on Poilievre's part to seize back the pipeline agenda a little bit from being just a Liberal storyline.
So here's a perhaps not shocking admission. I've never been lauded as the fastest or most powerful at anything. Rather, I think the adjectives plodding and reasonably sturdy are coded into the Herle DNA. So it's exciting to me when I'm at least adjacent to something that's recognized as fastest and most powerful. On November 17th, our presenting sponsor, TELUS's Sovereign AI factory in Rimouski, was named Canada's fastest and most powerful supercomputer. This, according to Top 500, a prestigious list that ranks the world's 500 most powerful computing systems. TELUS is the only telecom provider in Canada to be included on that list. And here's the truly geek-out piece of data that earned TELUS the honor. Top 500 rates a supercomputer's ability to solve complex sets of mathematical equations by measuring how many calculations a system completes every second. Get this, the Sovereign AI factory was able to complete 22.74 quadrillion calculations per second. That is immense processing power to handle the world's most demanding computational tasks. TELUS is using it to accelerate breakthroughs in multiple arenas, including healthcare, medical research, drug discovery, and genomic analysis. Sophisticated climate modeling and analysis that contributes to environmental sustainability, enhanced customer experience and business solutions, and advanced AI modeling for network optimization and service delivery. It's pretty heady stuff, and TELUS is rightly proud of the recognition, Herle-Burliites, and even more proud that their Sovereign AI factory proves that Canadian-owned, Canadian-operated infrastructure delivers world-class computing power while keeping all of the control, innovation, and economic benefits right here at home. I now return to my plodding and reasonably sturdy existence, but I promise you more cool AI stuff next week. Jordan, I watched this caucus, and it is a very similar, not identical caucus, but a very similar caucus to the caucus Trudeau had. And I watched these people be so lacking in courage that they were going to go to absolute certain defeat rather than create a little ruckus, a little tension with Mr. Trudeau, right? They could not get it. If it was not for Chrystia Freeland, they don't save themselves, and none of them have their jobs. So now they have their jobs because of Mark Carney, and surely to Christ they know that. They know that they have their jobs because of Mark Carney. I find it hard to believe there's going to be a bunch of people stand up and show their moral bona fides on climate when they wouldn't even stand up to save their own jobs.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's accurate to say it's not a group that's covered themselves in glory when it comes to courage around these things over the last year. But I actually, I would take issue with this strategy from the conservative from the opposite end. Like, I think it's a bit too clever by half. So, of course, the goal is clear. They want to use it to draw out the divisions within the liberal benches. But what you're doing there is you're giving opponents of this plan a relatively cost-free way to register, to go on the record that they have opposed it in some way. And if I were the PMO, I wouldn't be whipping that thing all that hard. This is an absolutely inconsequential way to allow some of those MPs to release some pressure on the issue. To get on the record as having been critical, let them talk about climate or whatever they want to talk about. And it has no impact on anything. So I actually think that it's not that sharp from the conservative perspective, because it's going to give people this sort of free pass to look as though they're doing something, they're opposing, they're being critical or whatever, without actually having any impact or heft within the operation of the agreement itself, or even within government. And I also think for the conservatives, Kory's right, it does get them back into the story, but then it leads to the next question, which is like, what the fuck would you guys do differently? Like, what is your, what is it that you have to offer on this? And I think that the optics last week of Poilievre being offside with Smith so dramatically was not really great for him. He didn't look as though he looked very on his back foot. He looked very defensive. And they really don't have much to put in the window there. So I think, for them, I would say this is probably a reflection of their eagerness to move off their own internal division stories and onto an internal division story about the Liberals. But I'm not actually sure it does as much for them as the clever people in the office of the Leader of the Official Opposition might think that it does.
Scott, do you think the Liberals are actually fracturing over climate?
No, just like you say, this is a group of people who screamed from the rooftop for 2 years, "We are vegans, all right? And you should be too." And Mark Carty came along and he said, "Here's some pork." And they said, I can't even answer. My mouth is full, right? Like, come on. No, they're not fracturing. I'm sure there's some people who, go, "Jesus, man." And I'm not even criticizing them for that, to be honest with you. I'm not. I mean, like, the name of the game is to not lose, right? Yeah. And also the name of the game is to respond to the threat that's in front of you. And the threat that's in front of you, yes, of course, climate change remains an existential threat. I myself am resigned to the fact that we'll all be wandering around with glass tubes over our head in order to, navigate the underwater levels that we'll be dealing with. But you got to deal with Trump, and you got to deal with the gigantic, enormous, immediate, urgent threat that he is. And so I think, to me, and I know, there couldn't be 4 people that more objectively represent the bubble than us, right? Like, we have a podcast that lasts like an hour and 15 minutes each week that's dedicated to talking about the intricacies of what occurred in Ottawa. But I think this is a bubble story, man. Like, I think it's a clever tactic. Don't get me wrong, I don't want to diss the conservatives. I think it's clever. And I hadn't even thought of Kory's point. Maybe that's some validity to it. I'll grant that as well. And I think, but it doesn't matter. So the Liberals have 5 members who vote against it. And what? Nothing. The Liberals vote entirely in favor of it. And what? Nothing. I don't really think it's going to have any consequence. So I think it's clever, but I think it reminds me of the argument that conservatives sometimes slap me across the face and say, which is, guys, remember, no one's fucking paying attention to this. You know what people are paying attention to? The fact that they can't afford to buy the Christmas presents that they wanted to, or that air transit might go on strike and they're not going to be able to go to the Dominican Republic with their mother-in-law and 3 children. And,
now you're just projecting.
I'm just a second. I'm not done. I got a few more fucking things to say to you,
I think people would understand,
I
might be better for everyone.
I think it's clever. I do think it's sort of cleverly tactically clever. I would say if they really wanted to go full Monty, they should have included the trade-offs that Carney secured as well. Because I think if that would make it even harder. Now there's technically, again, like, and as if who cares? I'm so down the drain pipe on this. But if you wanted to, you could let the leadership of the party, like the McKinnons of the world, could say, vote however you want, because you could always say I voted against it because it doesn't include the mentions of carbon capture or carbon pricing. So whatever. But I kind of think 2 weeks before Christmas, I don't know, if I was a conservative, I'd be tempted to be pounding away on affordability and the price of filling the stocking.
No, but wait a second, everybody. Surely to Christ, at their core, those images of Carney and Smith totally being ad idem with Carney and like this happy that's at their core, right? Like that is
I get that. That's why I agree with Kory.
They've got to do something to break up that relationship.
But this doesn't do that.
Yeah.
Right.
Like, but tactically maybe it helps. So like
they're trying to prove that there's a bunch of liberals that don't agree with this, and maybe.
Yeah, but so what? Like,
well, their narrative is, the conservative narrative is that this is not something that you can take at face value. That this is just, we were talking last week about how there's, part of the world who thinks this is, 3D chess, where the liberals never want to have a pipeline, and they're just making it look that way a little bit. That's kind of the conservative argument around this. And on the other side, there's people saying, no, this is actually, bringing the country together, and it's going to give resources to Tidewater, blah, blah, blah. It's, but it's going to force Alberta into accepting some emission controls voluntarily without, fighting them in court, and doing carbon capture and storage, etc. So there's like these two sides. And the side that conservatives are pressing on is to try to create a narrative that the liberals aren't committed to this thing. And I don't know. I don't see what's unstrategic about that. I think it's quite strategic.
I always hate it.
I think it's the tactical piece, but
in politics, when you're driven to that argument of, you can't really depend on them to do this thing that I've been demanding, or they're not doing it fast. It's like I spent 2 years insisting that my neighbor won't make a lemon meringue pie. She makes me a lemon meringue pie, and I'm like, this lemon meringue pie wasn't made sincerely, and I would have made it twice as fast, and it'd be twice as tasty. And this is kind of that happens to you in politics, but man, that's a shitty place to play.
Although I will say, like, I do think that Kory has a point in that, because of sort of the vagueness around some of the liberal narrative about this, like, they aren't fully owning it. So there is a story that's not being told there about the connection to the trade war. There's a story that's not being told there about the climate piece. And there is this sort of half-heartedness in we're just setting conditions, and now, the magic of the market's going to happen. So I think, like, there is some space for that. But again, to me, the question is, what would the conservatives be doing differently? That's not evident.
Well, if you're the liberals, why wouldn't you just put forward another motion, that includes the other pieces of it, and flip the table on the conservatives and say, okay, totally. So are you in favor of it if it includes these things? Having a debate. Well, but having a debate around this stuff isn't a bad thing. Like, as I think at the end of the day, there's another way you could look at it, which is the two main parties that account for the overwhelming supermajority of people who have a seat in the House of Commons are actually quite aligned at this moment in terms of building a pipeline. And, there's a little bit of finger pointing as to how sincere various people are on elements of that agreement. But if you've got Daniel Smith and Mark Carney agreed on a plan, I feel like you've encapsulated a huge percentage of the ideological spectrum on this issue.
So as we all enjoy the lights and the nostalgia and the goodwill, and for some of us, even the snow, our sponsor CN would like for just a moment to discuss something a little more prosaic. Grain. A little more than a week ago, CN broke the all-time November record for hauling grain out of Western Canada. It was the third consecutive monthly record. That's sort of a big deal for the Western Canadian economy, and for that matter, the rest of the country too. Now, I know you're all wondering what this all has to do with your ability to luxuriate in the indulgences of the holiday season. And as you might expect, we have the answer ready. The bread, pasta, cakes, Cookies, muffins, Yule logs, stuffing, and the whole slew of other delicacies you'll be savoring for the next few weeks rely on grain. Your morning cereal or porridge is based on grain. Most of those hearty winter soups and casseroles need grain as a base or thickener. What do beers and spirits begin with? Grain. The fuel that propels the vehicles you will use to visit family is partially derived from grain. Cooking oils? Often grain-based. The cosmetics you might apply on a special holiday occasion will likely contain grain. If you are a vegetarian, your holiday meals will definitely contain significant grains. If you aren't, the roast or the turkey or the goose or the ham on your feasting table would not likely exist were it not for grain-based livestock feed. Canada is sort of a grain champion. And to break grain delivery records, CN invests constantly in new technology, tracks, and rolling stock, working with our farmers, grain elevators, and ports, who often do the same. Like I said, it's a big deal. And now you know. Hey, Scott,
Yeah.
maybe there's no consequences as we're to Carney and the government, as we're saying in real terms, but this is probably the most dramatic shift that people are watching Carney from Trudeau in terms of the emphasis on climate. And, a lot of muscle memory was built up over 10 years, and maybe even longer in the Liberal Party, if you go back to Dion, etc., in the party over this. And so I'm struck by the fact that a guy like Jerry Butts, who, played a role in Carney's election, as leader and as prime minister, would put out on social media that carbon capture and storage still remains in the fiction department of bookstores.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I caught my eye as well.
And so I'm thinking about moral authority in the party and whether there's some of that seeping away in terms of his leadership. And it's actually taking me to a place about whether or not he doesn't need to talk to liberals in some way about what being a liberal means in 2025, 2026.
Well, I don't disagree with that last point, and I'm not sure I would come to that place and I would wander toward that conversation because of this, as though there's a sense of crisis or there's a creative conscience with respect to liberals, because I think that's a mistake to look at it that way. Because like what you're saying is profoundly correct. Pierre Trudeau defined the Liberal Party for a generation as being about constitutional reform, right? There were many, many issues during his time, and, maybe he had an indifference toward economic matters, but, the Liberal Party stood for national reconciliation and Quebec and national unity and bring home the country. It had that definition to it. Under Justin Trudeau, that era, it became about climate, and that's been the heart and soul of the Liberal agenda for the past decade. It really truly has. And so you're right, it is a huge breach. But again, I think that the Liberal Party has always been an adaptable and by definition reinventing instrument for political victory. And so I don't think that people require some rationale. Now, I think they get the 411 on this thing. We have a crisis. It's an external crisis. It's created by like the greatest Bond villain we can imagine. That's a challenge to our flag, the maple leaf, our way of life, our hopes and dreams. And so I don't think the prime minister has a lot of explaining to do on this in honesty. Now, it may be wise for him at some point to give a speech to liberals saying, right, here's the validating and rallying cause of our times, and understand how liberals express that point of view in this and the balance we strike. But I don't think you should do that at any sense of defensiveness, in the same way that I don't think that we should, as a government, the liberals should be spending their time spending all of their energy, vocabulary, and political capital on the critics of the pipeline MOU, because I think that would give too much credence to the 30% of people who have misgivings, as opposed to the 70% of people who like it for the macroeconomic opportunity that it represents. I'd reinforce the good rather than try to address the bad, because I don't know that the 30% can be turned around. So I hear what you're saying, but I think those caucus members will fall in line. I think they will fall in line because they recognize that this is the actual challenge of our times. And certainly it is the only path to electoral success. And by the way, if I was the prime minister's office, I'd say vote any way you like. Vote any way you like. There won't be any consequences. And then find out a year from now, you dumb fuck, if you vote against it, where you end up and whether or not your career is on the ascendant.
Jordan, Kory, do you got any thoughts about this party management side of it?
I mean, it's interesting. Oh, sorry, you go ahead first.
Well, I was just gonna point out that you really can't be divided on these big issues. Like, and yes, there has been a change, and I mostly agree with Scott that it's in keeping with the history of the Liberal Party in terms of being more flexible on ideological issues to bend towards where popular opinion rests at any given moment. And if there's ever an example of that being an appropriate move, it would be now, where you're seeing the environment generally and climate change polling as low as it has probably since the early 2000s. So it's, the fact that it's moving towards the economy and jobs and economic and energy security, like that is so much more where the electorate is, and it's so much or so obviously rather why Carney was elected is appropriate. And if people can't make that pivot, then I question whether or not they're in the right party, because I think the pivot itself is probably the most liberal thing you could ever imagine in terms of accepting that mandate. So, look, there was, I think, some ideological capture that occurred in the Liberal Party within that environmental movement, and some people were very okay with that. And other people were quite uncomfortable with that. Some people were frankly driven out of the Liberal Party, who, historically being a very big and important constituency of the Liberal Party. So, look, I think it's a rebalancing and something that looks more liberal than illiberal in terms of a historical view of the thing.
Yeah,
but you can't be both. You can't. It's like to say you can't ride two horses at the same time. Even Roy Rogers. Tough trick.
Well, and I don't think we've actually seen a whole lot of evidence that Mark Carney is interested in sort of the ideological coherence or, heritage of the Liberal Party as such, right? Like and that's putting it charitably. Like he's out there doing, and people can follow or not follow. And that's really, I think, what he's brought. And there's a reason for that. And it's a little bit, as Kory said, it's because the moral center of the Liberal Party is winning and holding power. And so as long as he is able to clearly demonstrate that he's delivering that, most people will be following along there. But I would make a distinction. Like, I do think that, well, he probably doesn't need to have a great big, rallying cry of what it means to be liberal and explaining this pivot for his own troops. Like they do need a narrative on climate. Like what they're doing right now is really just leaving a bit of a vacuum. And you have like Julie DeBruzen out there on Twitter being like, everything's great, nothing has changed, and Guilbeault out there saying the exact opposite. So like there is an opportunity that they're missing right now to actually make an effort to tell a bit of a story around that. And I'm not saying that that's an effort that's going to wholly placate that 30%, but there are things in that agreement. There is a story to be told there about this as a bargain, about what they're getting out of it, about the trajectory that they see, if not to 2030 to 2050. But there has been no effort to pull those threads together. And I do think that presents a risk for them in the medium term anyways.
Okay, time to hone in. I've talked here on behalf of our sponsor, the Canadian Climate Institute, about how important industrial carbon pricing is. The single biggest policy lever Canada has for reducing emissions while keeping costs low. In fact, it costs consumers next to nothing. But it has to be industrial carbon pricing that works. So here's the Climate Institute's primer on exactly what that means. Strengthening the policy is a critical part of the government's climate competitiveness strategy, as well as the headline-making MOU with Alberta. Industrial carbon pricing is only able to accomplish its goals because of the carbon credit markets they create and the private sector's ability to innovate and invest in low-carbon projects. But right now, those markets are not working the way they need to. Carbon credit prices are currently too low to incentivize enough investment. That needs to be fixed, and there's a simple way to do it. our federal and provincial governments can agree to creating a price floor that would establish the lowest price those carbon credits could trade for. The MOU with Alberta actually committed to something similar to a price floor, a minimum carbon credit price. Carbon credit prices would ramp up from below $20, which is where they are today, to $130. That should happen by 2030, according to the Climate Institute. Of course, the details of that Alberta agreement are still being ironed out, with a completion date no later than April 1. But again, according to the Climate Institute, a price floor is the simple fix for governments and industry to accomplish what this moment requires of Canada. Build the projects that reduce emissions and spur new investments that'll grow the globally competitive, low-carbon economy of the future. More detail on all of this at climateinstitute.ca. If you look at the deal with Smith, there is less climate there than Trudeau would have insisted on.
Sure.
And more climate there than Poilievre would have insisted on.
That's right. But
Isn't
that means
that, isn't
there's
that
a
the
story.
right porridge?
There is a
Isn't
story
that
to
the
be
right?
told
Isn't
there.
that the right temperature of porridge?
Well, I don't know. I'm not a climate scientist, and my plan is just to float away over the horizon. So but look, I think that it is a vulnerability, Kory, because why would you just leave that flank completely open when you have the option to try to make some efforts to close it? That's my point.
Yeah, I just don't think you want to spend a lot of time talking about the thing that 12% of people like, instead of the thing that 70% of people like. So
sure, but people are already talking about it, including your ministers, and they're talking off in all different directions.
The other thing that sort of gets under my skin around this is this notion that that Trudeau or Guilbeault or the previous administration were going to come anywhere close to hitting their fucking climate targets. They weren't. There was a 0.0% chance of hitting their 2030 or their 2050 targets. So, if you're talking about we're going to miss targets no matter what. And what is the difference between their version of missing the targets and Carney's version of missing the targets, or Poilievre's version of missing the targets? Then becomes about other things. But there are trade-offs in all of this. But this notion there was some climate warrior fucking paradise where all of this stuff was going to happen is just a false narrative at its core.
I know we should probably move on, David. I just want to add one quick thing on this. I think that's all. I think there's a trap in this discussion that just unfolded between Jordan and Kory for the Liberals. For Carney in particular, I think there's a trap. And I might be wrong. Maybe Jordan's right. Maybe you need to spice a little balance into this recipe. But my view is that it's even more, it's a little different than your porridge analogy. My view is you could look at this and go, you know what? By moving toward an embrace of carbon pricing, by moving toward carbon capture in a substantial way, should the technology actually be workable, I think you can make the argument that this may achieve far more from a climate perspective than anything that happened over the course of the past decade. And that the irony is that in this MOU, he will have moved the yardsticks in a practical and results-oriented way, but we won't know for 7, 8, 9 years, but that this may actually be much more substantive than introducing a consumer carbon pricing scheme that not only managed to rally the country in its hatred and opposition. And my warning would be, don't make that argument. I know you'll be tempted when you get criticized to make that argument. And you'll say, see, I'm clever and I put together this intricate thing that is going to have this result. Because then you're arguing against yourself.
Yep.
The core of the argument is an economic response that is based not around the brilliance of pipelines. It's based around we need to have an economic policy that is independent from the shackles that the United States places on us so that we have the opportunity to make choices of our own. And I would be selling that argument all the time.
They're not selling that one, though, either.
Well, I think
they're
pounding it harder. I'd be putting out ads on that right now.
Well, I think that was your point last week, largely, Scott.
It's always
and maybe ours, that we, you gotta talk about the big thing. That's what you got to talk about. You got to focus on the big thing. But the other thing that I think is lost in this by the climate warrior class is if they were left to their own devices, every single measure related to this stuff would be fucking gone.
What does the
Like,
climate
you
warrior
know,
class look like? Like that's
uh,
actually a
tell me
classroom.
more,
How are they
Kory.
dressed and what's
Are
the teacher like?
illustrate your straw man for us, please?
Well, I don't think it's much of a straw man. It's single issue people who that is their sole focus and why they're in politics. It's like, there is a anti-abortion or pro-life or whatever, single issue people. There are people who are single issue gun people. But there are single
Climate
issue
warrior
climate
class.
people.
You're
Where
both gone now, Kory.
ready.
You need another. We
No,
need
well,
another punching bag.
it's more
The
than
chalkboard they
Guibo.
write with like beetroot on the
Well,
board, and everyone eats
like,
soap that's been made from lentils.
how about the Green Party? Like they're obviously that in spades. So like, look, there are
I
people
don't
out
know.
there
Elizabeth May was out
that
saying she might still support Kory.
well,
She's the best.
she's
I'm for him.
got
I'll never be for him again.
she
I might be for him again.
Maybe.
I've always thought the Greens were kind of an offshoot of the Liberal Party, but but she is, clearly that is what animates her and her involvement in politics. So I don't know. What are you arguing? There are single issue environmental voters? Is that your argument?
I'm just having fun.
There are.
I think we're just mocking
Climate
you now.
warrior.
Yeah.
Climate warrior class.
Did you know that Canada is a global leader in the production of medical isotopes? Canadian isotopes are life-saving tools used around the world every day to diagnose and treat cancers, sterilize medical equipment, and advance medical research. For decades, Canadian nuclear innovation has powered breakthroughs across healthcare, industry, and research. And today, through the Isotopes for Hope campaign, the Canadian Nuclear Isotope Council is working to double our isotope production by 2030. Why? Because the world is counting on Canada. Medical isotopes are a promise that patients will get faster, more accurate diagnoses, a promise that hospitals will have the tools they need to precisely treat cancer and other diseases, and a promise that Canada will continue to lead in the development of nuclear technologies that benefit people here at home and around the world. From our CANDU power reactor fleet to our accelerator network, from research labs to hospitals, Canadians are driving innovation that brings hope and saves lives. By supporting Isotopes for Hope, we're not only securing Canada's leadership in the global isotope market, but we're also helping build a healthier future for everyone. The world is counting on us, but we can only rise to this challenge if we work together. It will take all of us, industry, the healthcare sector, governments, and the scientific community, all aligned to maximize the potential of Canadian-made isotopes and ensure that we continue to bring hope to patients when they need it most. Learn more at www.canadianisotopes.ca. All right, let's do our clipping. Are you ready? Let's do our clipping. All right. Clipping is from Susan Delacourt in the Toronto Star. I'll read a few segments here. Progressive-leaning folks are having a hard time watching Mark Carney link arms with the same forces that spent the past decade demonizing the Liberals. Whether it's making a deal with Alberta Premier Danielle Smith or playing to the bro culture with all the sports talk and walking back feminist foreign policy, it seems like the Prime Minister is determined to cozy up to the Liberals' old, harshest critics. Making enemies into friends may make political sense, but it also may make democratic sense too. The level of toxicity in this country needed to be dialed back, not simply to improve Liberal fortunes, but to build some bridges between government and some of Canada's most affected citizens. Many progressives are coming to the view that Carney's going overboard to appease the Liberals' old critics in a bid to steer the party back to the center. Maybe, but it could also be true that Carney is trying to do a democratic detox too, trying to shore up the consent to be governed where it has been wavering the most in recent years. So, this is the flip side of the conversation we've just been having, which is there some political value in the fact that Carney seems to not want to have all the fights that Trudeau wanted to have with people and seems more determined to get along with people and less confrontational in his approach than Trudeau was. Jordan.
Yeah, well, I feel like Susan was writing to me, and and I admit I really like her writing because I think is like I found it a very provocative question, and I want to take her thesis seriously because I actually think she's not arguing that it's a political benefit. She's arguing that it's a democratic benefit. She's
Correct.
arguing
Yeah.
she's arguing that it's a
I meant
sort of
small p. Sorry, but yeah.
yeah, and I think that those are actually really different questions in a lot of ways, and because some of these things may not be straightforward politically, but may have some benefit for cohesion over the long run. But I will say I did find myself bracing and resistant to her argument for a few reasons, and I think that one of the things that really strikes me, and this was true during the Trudeau government as well, is that one of the biggest challenges, and this is really a challenge that social democrats kind of have around the world right now, is that, generally progressives like tend to view the government as a force for good in the world and in people's lives, right? But that is all predicated on the idea that people understand the government as a mechanism that can deliver things for them, that can impact their lives in a positive way, that they see that happening, and they believe that the government has capacity for it. And so for me, one of the idea of these moving to the center and sort of embracing these groups and political formations that had been alienated under Trudeau, like that's not deep enough. Like that is not actually sufficient to address some of the problems that we have around those democratic divides. Because what we're really seeing right now, and Coletto's written quite a bit about this in terms of the question of precarity, right? But where you really start to see anti-democratic things happening, it's because people believe that no political party is able to address the precarity that they're living in. And so the question of whether a government can deliver or not, whether a government can live up to the promises that it makes or not, and whether they do that in the course of their mandate is actually really important. And I was struck last week that, one of the things that we saw as there were so many headlines going by was the news about the Building Canada homes. So you have the government making, for example, very significant commitments about the level of affordable homes they're going to create in Canada. This is a huge issue we know among the public. People are very worried about this. This is impacting people's lives. And you got the PBO coming out and saying, like, congratulations, you're going to build 26,000 houses. Like, it's not going to fucking work because you've built it, in a way that has no measurements, and it's not actually going to deliver. And I think that those things are actually, that is very corrosive. It's also corrosive when people campaign one way and govern another, because that is the idea that there is a political class there that when they get into power does something very different from what they told voters they would do on the hustings. And lastly, I think, we have to consider as well, what was it that also fueled some of those divides in the Trudeau years? And I'm thinking about divides where you saw young men moving out of more progressive vote coalitions. I'm thinking divides in the West. I'm thinking, working class voters, men in general, also moving to the Conservatives. And one of the biggest features of this actually was the tone of condescension. The tone of condescension that came off the Trudeau government, this idea that we know better how everyone should live their lives and that we're virtuous in this, and that gives us the ability to then sort of dictate this outwards to everybody else.
Yeah.
Well, it turns out that is actually rocket fuel for people who are out there sort of seeking to divide. And then the last thing I'll say, because you can see Susan really got me going, the last thing I'll say about this is that I think we have to be really careful when we talk about the origins of these divides and this toxicity and what is actually kind of driving that within the Canadian democratic space. It does not just appear. It is fed by certain groups and politicians for political purposes. It's fed by politicians who engage in attacks on democratic institutions for political purposes. And again, here we have like a really fresh example of this, where you had Danielle Smith out there this week talking about the courts, in a way that was really sort of set to kind of undermine their legitimacy. And this stuff is not cost-free. Like, she is clearly doing it for a political purpose, but it has a long-term negative effect in terms of how people see and understand those institutions in their lives. So I would say, I think that it's a provocative and interesting thesis. I don't agree with it. I think that there's other things at play there. But I think that what Carney should and maybe could take from this is really also a question of what that relationship looks like at a tonal level. And that was something where the Trudeau government really missed the mark, and it allowed the conservatives and the right and people who maybe even further to the right, who really do have some anti-democratic tendencies, to connect with people who feel that precarity through like negative resentment stuff. And they need to find a different path. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk.
I loved it.
Yeah,
Thank you. That
I
was a
loved it.
TED Talk, and it was very compelling. So thank you. It was great.
The following message is brought to you by Unsmoke Canada. Not all nicotine products carry the same risk. Smoke-free alternatives like heated tobacco, vaping products, and nicotine pouches don't burn tobacco or produce smoke. While not risk-free, evidence shows they have the potential to be significantly less harmful than cigarettes. Yet, Canadian regulations restrict access and limit communication about these alternatives, keeping adult smokers in the dark. Sweden has accepted this science, embraced smoking harm reduction, and driven smoking rates below 6%. Canada has the tools to do the same, but it requires political will. It's time to align regulation with science, expand access to smoke-free products, and empower Canadians to make informed choices. The evidence is clear. The opportunity is real. Canada can be smoke-free. Learn more at unsmoke.ca.
I have a little framework, which is to say that I think the last election fundamentally came down to people who think that the system and its institutions are under threat and need saving, and people who think that the system and our institutions have let them down and are broken and need to be swept away and replaced with something else.
Or not
And
replaced.
I think the Carney is putting together a pretty good story about the system and institutions as far as that can go. But if you don't believe in it, you don't believe in it. And if your cost of living isn't changing, your cost of living isn't changing. Kory, all of which makes me kind of skeptical that we can really breach the fissures in our society by being nicer to each other.
Well, I'll kind of take it in a slightly different direction. First of all, that was a good set of arguments, Jordan. And David, I agree largely with what you just said about what the frame of the last election is. But I think there is a different thing that's a part of Susan's column that I think is very on point. And it's something that Scott Galloway's written a lot about, including I think it's New York Times bestselling book right now, Notes on Being a Man.
Yeah.
And something that our own Michael Spitali.
I'm going to read that as soon as Scott's done with it.
And our own Michael Spitali on the Air Quotes Media website has written a really good article on this. And that is the men problem that progressive parties have. There is a lot of time spent talking about problems that conservative parties have with female voters. And I think those are good conversations to have too. But what always seems to get left out is the conversation around why young men are so hostile today compared to how they've been historically to progressive parties. It used to be you could kind of determine who people were going to vote for more based on age. The old Churchill quote of, if you're not a progressive when you're younger, then you're heartless. And if you're not a conservative when you're older, you lack a brain, or whatever the line was.
I'm going to live forever.
But right. But look, there's, I think, one of the unintended but very real consequences of Justin Trudeau, but it's not limited to him, because I think this has been a problem for the progressive left for a while now, is they have had a very anti-male narrative. If you want to talk, about symbols and things, we talked a little bit about a feminist foreign policy and all of that. There's a lot of stuff that is very divisive because it's
men are
putting
bad,
a frame.
Kory.
Sorry?
Men are bad.
Well,
You wouldn't need a criminal code if it wasn't for men. You wouldn't need
sure.
the 10 Commandments if it wasn't for men.
But
You would.
but I
Women
will
just know these things.
Sure, and and
There's
Nicole
a reason women pick the bear.
and Nicole would agree with most of that, I think, if she were on the podcast. But I will say this: if you have a society that is governed for a prolonged period of time in a way that is alienating young men, watch out, because the really worst things that happen in democracies are when you have large swaths of young men that feel completely disenfranchised from the politics and the governance of the country. Yeah. Those are the people who take up arms and do, really wild stuff, historically speaking. I'm not saying we're on the verge of that happening here, obviously, but we should take that seriously. And I think, like, the Scott Galloway point would be that there are some reasons why young men are feeling really not good about the world. And, they're way less likely to get a post-secondary education. They're, 3 times as likely to kill themselves. They're 3 times as likely to end up with addiction problems. There's all kinds of things that if we're looking at macro stats, would say, we've got a problem here, and we need to spend more time thinking about this and talking about this. And the solution isn't to wag your finger and demonize people. Like, that's the least persuasive thing you can do. I don't care who you're talking about, but young men are no different than anybody else when it comes to that. So, like, I think, Susan's point is maybe a little more about that. At least my reading of the column is that there's an element there that requires some more consideration. And look, insofar as we do that, I think it's probably good for our politics and good for our society.
Cool. Scott?
Well, hats off to Susan, because this column seems to be provoking a series of TED Talks. We're each doing deep dives, and I have my own analysis that I think is distinct from everything that people have said, although I think everybody has said something interesting. I do want to add, I don't know if this is going to get me in trouble with the 99% of our listeners. I agree with a lot of what Scott Galloway has to say, but I can't shake the feeling that 75% of what Scott Galloway says is engineered to get him laid after a book reading. Like, it just feels like it's a play, I'm just saying.
Is that true with Spitali too? Because I don't know. He was saying a lot of the same
certainly
stuff.
No question.
Be
No
the
question
first
there.
Male author to exercise that.
I was thinking that at the Paul Wells event too.
Yeah. I come at this from a slightly different lens, in the sense that, well, first of all, actually, before the thought escapes, Herle will agree with this strongly, I know. I want to thank Susan for making reference to one of my all-time favorite lines that our friend Larry Hagan wrote, which was, the line about a nation when it withdraws its consent to be governed. It was captivating, leapt off the page, leapt out of Paul's mouth when Larry wrote it, and he's missed. David, your point, which I think is super interesting, will Carney succeed in this effort to try to heal divisions? That, I don't think that's what her column is about. I think she's asking the question, why is Carney doing this? And her answer is, he's not doing it for political gain. He's doing it in order to help heal and salvage democracy and some of the, and I disagree with that. I disagree with that because I think it underestimates the driving, determining force of self-interest in politics. And that isn't to say that this might not be a benefit, and it isn't to say that Carney isn't the sort of person who's capable of considering those factors and thinking that perhaps he is slowly, incrementally trying to restore some faith in institutions, and that is a response to so many political movements that we witness around the world right now. But I think the fundamental factor is that Carney came in and he had a set of challenges, and it looked like he was taking over a ship that was broken and headed toward the bottom of the ocean. And his response was based on rallying the country against the threat that presented itself. So I think it is less about, I don't believe that there's this trade-off in his mind saying, listen, I know I'm making some political sacrifices here by, doing these things, and it's going to cause me massive political risk, but it's worth doing it because I think ultimately we might heal our democracy. I think that also underestimates, by the way, the determination of the professionally, perpetually, irrationally pissed off cohort of those voters. I don't know that they can be fixed or brought back. But I think she's saying, why is he doing this? And her answer is because he wants to help heal democracy. And I don't think that's true. I think that he looks at it and says, I took Trudeau's chair at the poker table, and these are the cards I have in the game I got to play, and I got to play this as well as possible. And dealing with Trump and managing Trump, and if that means that I have to deal with the likes of Danielle Smith, and I have to push through stuff, and I take a higher degree of criticism from the climate constituency, and I take a much higher degree of criticism from the Indigenous constituency, those are things I'm going to have to deal with, because I think that that is what's necessary to deal with the problem that confronts me. And that problem that confronts me is my political strategy. I have to be seen to be dealing with it. That's my political salvation. That's what got me elected. And if I can keep fueling it, and I think, by the way, we're seeing that he's right so far when you look at the polls. I mean, the numbers have, according to Abacus and others, they have sort of rallied in favor of the MOU writ large. They've sort of bolstered the party and its standing. Post-budget, everybody's like, well, the budget doesn't do this, it doesn't do that. But it seems to have steadied and strengthened the government. And I think that's because he understands what the big picture mission is, and he's feeding that. And hopefully that will help heal democracy. But I don't think that's why he did it, if I'm being entirely honest. I think he's doing it because it's a political challenge that confronts him, and he's trying to navigate it.
I think the reason why the polls are where they're at is because more so than any issue that you could identify, any policy area, the country knows it needs leadership. And Carney is winning that argument so decisively that it's swamping any policy considerations.
Yes.
All right.
Agree on that.
There's one last thing I want to talk about, and I just want to declare off the top that I have a conflict of interest here. This is a client of mine that I am working on, but nonetheless, it's an important political consideration. I felt we should talk about it, and that's Algoma Steel, and the fact that both the federal and provincial governments gave a fair whack of money to Algoma Steel. And Algoma Steel subsequently announced the layoff of 1,000 people, and there's been a lot of brouhaha about that in the House of Commons and out. And so, just to take a step back, I mean, here's a steel mill that is facing 50% tariffs as a result of Trump, and so their American business disappeared virtually immediately upon those 50% tariffs being put in place. That was like 70% of their business. So this is something, the reason I give you that background, that context, is because it feels to me this is something that's likely to be replicated in various other elements of the economy, where our U.S. trade-threatened industries have to take a step back, consolidate before they can step forward and start to find new markets and build new business cases for themselves. But the politics of it are quite difficult. So, Scott, do you want to start us off?
Well, I'm probably going to have the briefest and most uninteresting take, because I think there is just an undeniable reality here, which is these aren't normal times. And because they're not normal times, government is going to say, all right, well, to sustain the existence of steel in Sault Ste. Marie, to maintain some domestic industry, yes, we are going to write that check. And no, it's not like the car deals of a few years ago when you were trying to trade stuff and build in provisions. I think it is what the minister said, right, which is trying to save the furniture and trying to hold fast and firm in this time. So my take is, sure, you're going to get, people are going to ask those tough questions, and it's right to ask those tough questions and beat the government up and beat the company's leadership up on all that sort of stuff. But I can't help but think about it. What would I do if I was in the prime minister's office? And I know I wouldn't have said, sorry, man, we don't do it. Like, chances are they're just going to turn around and lay a bunch of people off anyway, or we know they're going to lay off a bunch of people anyway. Screw it. Like, we're going to let this thing sink. They're not going to let this ship sink right now. They're going to do what they can to try to keep it afloat so that they can try to get it back into the bay 6 months, 1 year, 18 months from now. And by the way, and I'll end on this, if you're offended by what you just saw there, you're going to hate the next 2 years, because as he cancels CUSMA and goes after a whole other series of sectors, the Treasury is going to have to make really difficult decisions, the Canadian Treasury, about doing similar kinds of deals without the sorts of guarantees that we get in different times from industry. And I just think you're going to see that this is going to be forced. And you can't stand up and say, we have your backs, and then say no. So it's an uncomfortable truth, but there's going to be a lot of C-suites that hear the word yes.
Jordan?
Man, I mean, this is what we feared, right? This is when we talked about what the sectoral impacts were going to be. 1,000 people getting pink slips right before Christmas in a city of 72,000. This is the bad stuff. We are in the bad place. And I think the politics of this are just brutal. One of the biggest questions I think that Canadians have when it comes to the trade war, and yes, voters did largely put their faith in Carney in terms of leading them through this and confronting the trade war. But one of the core questions, and one of the questions that's going to be, by the way, very important for liberal conservative voters, I think as well, is who pays the price for the trade war? Who is left holding the bag at the end of the day when these difficult decisions are being made? And I think what's so troubling, not just about the decision in Algoma, but we saw this as well in Stellantis, is that you have a situation now where the government is, and I think rightly, stepping in to help these companies and these industries that are so critical to have here in Canada in an attempt to protect them in these extraordinary circumstances. But they're doing so without the conditions that would ensure that it is not the working people and the workers who are left holding that bag. And so right now, we are left with a situation where Carney was elected to help stop this bleed, to help protect people from some of the worst impacts of this trade war. And instead, we have the appearance that he has given money to a company, knowing full well, by the way, and the secrecy is another element of this that's really problematic, that these layoffs were going to happen. They were going to now happen sooner. They were going to happen maybe at a greater magnitude than was originally planned. And they really have very little to say in their defense about what they did to prevent that in the course of providing that support. So I agree that we are in a moment of very tough decisions right now, but it is so vital, not just politically, but also I think for our country and in terms of people feeling, and going back to what we were talking about earlier, feeling as though the government is capable of delivering for them, that it is not working people that are left holding the bag in these situations. So in this case, the company was given the support they needed to remain whole and to survive this, but those workers were not. And that, I think, is absolutely untenable as we move forward. There were other options the government can look at.
That's a bank-breaking principle, though, Jordan. Jesus.
Well, I'm not saying that the government should not be there to provide assistance. They absolutely should. But it needs to roll in conditionality around employment, around transition. The government can also look at other things. They can look at taking an equity stake. There are different tools on the table, and now is the time to really think creativity, not just about preserving those companies, but again, about who is left bearing the insecurity, bearing the risk, bearing the threat of this trade war. Because I think right now, this and Stellantis was a fail for the government on this, and certainly a fail that those workers and that community is going to feel acutely.
Kory, governments don't really like getting pissed on after they give away $500 million, do they?
Yeah, they don't. Well, I guess I should probably say I have some level of conflict on this too, just because we work together, although I haven't worked on this file. I don't know. I think my comments would be, fairly high level in general. Like, look, I think if you're the government with these challenging politics that Jordan and Scott laid out, communicating the plan and doing it with as much transparency as you possibly can is probably as good as it gets in terms of trying to do this. These things are complicated, right? Like and whether it's the auto sector or whether it's steel or whether it's things in agriculture, we're in like very integrated global markets. And if we want to talk about steel in particular, steel produced in a bunch of different places around the world and around North America. and being sold into a common sort of free trade environment. That's gone. And if we want to have a steel industry, we're going to have to figure out, how we want to live in that world, right? But the notion that not an ounce of Canadian steel is going to go into our shipbuilding program, which has been the case heretofore, is probably not something that can be justified. And the fact that we're not making steel beams for all the condo towers, I look out my window seeing being built down here, that's probably not sustainable either. Or the fact that US companies could bid on projects requiring steel in Canada, but the reverse isn't true. That's probably not sustainable. We're going to have to change the way we approach all this, and there's going to have to be some sort of bridge to that future that the government lays out. And what requirements it puts on that. I hear Jordan's point on that. I think that's a fair one. I think there's probably some tactical stuff around. If there's going to have to be some realignment on employment levels, you probably should have that out there publicly before you write the check. It's probably going to go better for you, but I'll put that all in the category of transparency. But what's the plan? But if it's a plan where we're going to pay a bunch of money for an industry that's going to die, that's not a plan a lot of people are going to get behind. If it's a plan that all the workers get laid off and the company's shareholders get protected, but the workers don't, that's not a very sellable plan either. So I don't know. I'm less concerned about taking equity positions than some other conservatives might be. And maybe it's just because I was around the Harper administration when we took an equity position in the auto companies. I would point out in the end, the government made money on that, didn't lose money. And that's maybe a better way of looking at some of these things. But I don't know. It's going to be, to Scott's point, a very difficult period of time. And we're going to have to make some very tough decisions as a country. And I think it's best for the government to be very transparent about what those choices are and what we're doing and why we're doing it and what that future looks like. And if this is a bridging strategy, what are we bridging to? And, talk about some of the other elements of it. If it takes a while to spin up making plate steel for ships, and that's part of the plan, talk about that. I don't know.
But boy, the politics of a retrenching economy are shitty.
Oh, they're awful. They're awful.
And that's what we're
but a little
with.
Like a little bit more Churchill would probably be advisable. Talk a little bit more about what we're staring down and what
stop
the possible
talking the economy
are.
up. Stop bragging about the latest
right.
GDP numbers and remind us that we're in
And
a goddamn crisis.
They're not helpless in
end
this,
of it.
right? Like they are approaching these conversations with leverage. Okay, so they need to use it.
Yeah, I agree with all that.
All right, let's wrap it up. Mr. Pinson, can you assemble the hordes for the Hey You?
Ladies and gentlemen, please return to your seats. The Hey Yous are about to begin.
I have one. I want to go before Kory, because it may cause his head to pop off.
Oh, good. I might have to change mine now.
You may agree with this, actually. I've been thinking about this for a week and a half or so, and my Hey You goes out to Stephen Guilbeault, and he's taken a lot of grief, particularly from Kory on this pod. And,
wow.
Notwithstanding the whole discussion we had with respect to climate and the pipeline debate that will happen this week and the votes and all that sort of stuff, I just think Stephen Guilbeault deserves a tip of the hat, because I look at how he's handled the past 2-3 weeks and I say to myself, this is a guy who's dedicated his entire life to climate and environmental action. This is a guy who then decided that he was going to make the move into electoral politics without, I think, for a second expecting that he was going to be able to preserve every principle he ever had. I think he understood that you're going to have to make compromises in electoral life, and you play for a team. And he implemented a series of measures, pursued a bunch of policies, and was a voice for a certain perspective on climate and, clean electricity regs and so many other things that he championed. And then when push came to shove over this MOU, he came to the perspective that he just simply it was too much for him. And and that's more or less the way he's argued. He did not go out there and say, I'm going to unleash cannon fire. I'm going to try to sink the ship.
I don't know how closely you've been paying attention. I'm going to interrupt your Hey You. How closely have you been paying attention? This guy just over the weekend said that the fucking pipeline is going to create Quebec separatism. Going to cause Quebec to separate. I was with him up until I think that Jesus slipped off the cracker a little
All
bit,
right.
as they
I don't
say
know,
in
man.
Queen's Park.
I think by and large, he has said, I had a responsibility. I'm going to stay in the caucus. I'm choosing to stay in the caucus. I'm trying not to take down the prime minister, but I'm going to tell you what I did and why I did it. And I couldn't stand to be in cabinet any longer.
But-
I couldn't pretend to support it, so I'm stepping down. I think that's kind of the whole idea of ministerial responsibility and being honorable about it.
I would have been with you a week ago, but I think over the course of the last week, his commentary has shifted in a way that's quite unhelpful.
Well, I think that was my hey you last week, but I'm kind of with David that, if you keep talking about it after that, I'm going to have to retract my my Scott like hey you of last week and say, then why don't you just fucking fully resign?
Yeah.
Well,
all right.
enough.
Jordan, hey you.
Well, I'm
It's
gonna.
not hey you.
Hers is also about
Unusually
Debo.
rejected by the group. Not normal that a hey you just gets outright rejected by the rest of the group.
You're wrong, Scott.
I assume that you're going to demand that Gibo join the New Democrats, and we can have another round of
They won't
discussion
take
about
him.
him
They've
and his
already
future.
said.
Yeah,
he's
I
not
mean-
wanted.
I think they should take him if he wanted to come, but
No
anyway,
kidding.
that's a
No
separate
fucking
Yeah, no
conversation.
kidding. Is right.
We
Right.
should be taking many people at this point. Which actually leads me nicely into my hey you. We have a theme today, Scott and I, which is former Trudeau cabinet ministers. And my hey you this week is going out to Mark Miller. I was really happy to see Mark Miller come back. And I was doubly happy that Mark Miller did not wait one fucking hot minute to start dropping some truth bombs in his first scrum as minister.
Yeah.
He was out there. He was talking about, he talked about a lot of things, and I think he made more headlines in that first scrum than Carney made all week last week. But he talked about, among other things, how the government needed to really have started on Indigenous consultation yesterday. And he would know, guys, because among that group of folks in cabinet, he is the one who has done the most work, the deepest work on building those relationships with Indigenous communities. It is my hope that he will be listened to on that, because I think he's got a lot of wisdom to share with the group. But more broadly, I want to send out a hey you to him for just going out and giving that advice and being frank, because the Prime Minister doesn't need a cabinet full of people who are editing themselves into what they think he wants to hear. They need people who are doing the work, who are team players, but who are providing some candor, some good advice. And I think Mark is one of those people. I think he's very smart, and I think he's going to be a real asset to the team. So I was quite happy to see him back and to see him back on his bullshit. I loved it.
See, Scott, no, that's a good hey you. See, like, I fully endorse that hey you. Like, that's a hey you I can get behind.
Well, it's a hey me. It's just me. It's just my opinion. It's my little opinion. Just me. And if it's projected, I'll go listen to a Scott Galloway podcast and try to find a way as a man in this world to feel better about myself.
Kory, what do you got?
Well, I was going to do a hey you to the Conservative Party National Council. I saw that they made a decision to allow the leader of the party to select 8 candidates of his own choosing. I am a big fan of this model. We've used it for, I think, 3 elections now provincially. You often see incumbents protected in their nominations. That's a pretty standard thing, I think, in most caucuses. And then you'll see in other ridings sometimes people barred from being candidates for one reason or another in their background. But when you see the biggest fights and nasty stuff go on in nomination meetings, it's because there's like a total A-list candidate that the leader of the party or the leadership of the party wants to get in. And then they try to kind of reverse engineer a nomination process that allows them to win. And I just think that creates all kinds of acrimony. You've got people that spend large amounts of their own personal time and money running for a nomination when really the cake is baked before the ingredients go in the mixer. And I think it just leads to a lot of division and sometimes lawsuits and all kinds of other stuff. I think it's perfectly appropriate for leadership and the leader to be able to pick some star candidates that would probably otherwise not run. If it were a contested nomination and people say, well, then, they shouldn't, if they can't win the nomination, then they shouldn't be in the parliament. Well, if you want all, salespeople and assistant pastors and, folks involved in, kind of grassroots organizations, but no experience in other parts of life, then take that approach.
There was no way that we were going to be able to nominate Ken Dryden in York Centre or David Emerson in Vancouver Kingsway. There's just no way that they were going to win nominations.
Exactly.
Well,
we want them to be candidates. You have to appoint them.
Well, we were talking about, single issue folks and stuff, and have many times in the past, like they tend to do better in nomination battles than folks that have a broader appeal. But I think, the parliament is better and your caucus is better if there's some diversity in there. I think, actually, we've provincially used it, I think, only one time. Somebody can correct me if I'm wrong about that. But the ability to state a preference for a candidate, and then just have other people back away because they know that person's going to be appointed is normally the way it goes. And, but I think it's perfectly appropriate to have that. I think it strengthens, your bench strength in caucus. I was glad to see them make that decision. And I think it's going to bode well for the party going into the next election, because I think they'll have some new faces that might not otherwise have gotten there that will add something to the mix.
Well, there you go. My random hey you this week goes out to Steve McKinnon. I think that of all the political operations of the government, the House management seems competent, smooth, confident, strategic, like they know what they're doing. And I attribute a lot of that to Steve. And I also think that Steve is providing a lot of political counsel to the Prime Minister that's useful, that might normally be coming from other places, but these days I think comes from ministers as much as anything. And Steve, one of the leading ones. So as somebody that worked a long, long time in politics and has now gotten to a place where he is right at the top of the food chain in the government. Very impressive career, Steve, and you're doing a great job. Hey, you. All right, folks, that's our show this week. Thank you three for being with me. Fun as always. Good time as always. Scott, come up with a better hey you next time.
I feel shame.
All right, every week is a new opportunity, Scott.
Thank you all you accursed for watching or listening to this show. Thanks to the sponsors who make it possible. And we'll see you next week. Come back. It's great.